You are on HOA catastrophe. The mailbox cluster heard every threat. I had the post in the ground and the concrete poured when Anne appeared at the property line with a flashlight, shouting that I was done, that I had 0 warnings left, and that she was finished being nice. You are out of warnings, and I am done being nice. She swept the beam along the fence boards like she was marking evidence at a crime scene. I stood there in my work gloves with wet concrete setting around the post, the bucket hat keeping the evening drizzle off my face, and I knew this was going to be bad. Seattle drizzle had been threatening all week, and I work union apprentice hours as an electrician, which means job site start at 6 in the morning and no room for delays. I had exactly 1 evening window to finish the post before the weather turned and the ground turned to soup. The preserve at Oak Grove Ridge Association had been escalating for 2 weeks over a fence repair that should have been a non-issue, and Ann Anderson, the board secretary, controlled every scrap of paperwork that moved through the HOA. She stepped closer, the flashlight beam cutting across my face. I decide what counts as compliant, not you. That was her line, the one she loved, and she delivered it with a smile that made my stomach twist. I kept my voice level and asked what the problem was. She said the post was 6 inches over the setback easement, and that I had missed a mandatory hearing 2 days ago, which was news to me, because I never got a notice. She pulled a folded paper from her cardigan pocket and waved it like a trophy. Your paperwork is cute, mine has a letterhead. I glanced at the paper. It was a hearing notice dated for a meeting I was never informed about, with a line at the bottom saying my failure to appear constituted an admission of violation. I said I never got that notice, and she said the HOA mailed it to my address on file, which was correct, but I checked my mailbox daily, and nothing had arrived. She shrugged and said that was my problem, not hers. The fine schedule started tonight, $50 per day until I removed the post and reapplied for approval with a revised survey and a contractor bond. I asked if I could see the original complaint, and she said it was in the file, and I could request a copy at the next board meeting in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The weather would bury this project by then, and I would lose the deposit I put down on the contractor. I told her I had a permit from the city and a survey from a licensed crew showing the setback was clear. She said the HOA rules superseded city permits and that I should have checked the covenants before I started work. That was when I noticed the survey stakes along the property line. They had orange flags, and I had placed them myself the week before, matching the licensed survey I paid for. Except now 2 of the stakes were 6 inches farther into my yard than I remembered. I stared at them, and then at Anne, and she smiled again. The flashlight beam moved along the fence boards, and she said she had measured the height before the post was even set, and I was already over the 48-inch maximum by 2 inches. I said the post was not even braced yet, and she said that was irrelevant because the violation was ongoing. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of the stakes, the post, the concrete, and Anne standing there with her flashlight. She said recording her without consent was harassment, and I said I was documenting my own property. She said the easement was HOA jurisdiction, and I was trespassing on common area. I said the survey showed this was my lot, and she said her survey showed otherwise. I asked to see it, and she said it was in the file. I had been a member of the Preserve at Oak Grove Ridge Association for 8 months, and this was the 3rd time Anne had found a violation on my property that required immediate correction and a fee. The first was a mailbox post that was 4 inches too tall. The second was a trash bin that sat in the driveway 10 minutes past the Monday morning pickup window. Both times she had appeared with a clipboard and a smug lecture. And both times, I paid the fine because I thought it was easier than fighting. That was a mistake. She pulled a handheld label maker from her cardigan pocket and printed a sticker right there on the property line. She peeled it off the backing and slapped it onto the fence post above the wet concrete. I could not read the text, but I knew what it said. Something about violation and correction required. She had used the label maker before, tagging a rake I left leaning against the garage and a garden hose that was visible from the street. It was her signature move, turning my property into her evidence board. I said I would attend the next board meeting and request a formal hearing. She said the next meeting was full and I would need to submit a written request 14 days in advance. I said I would submit it tomorrow, and she said the 14-day window had already passed for the next meeting, so the earliest I could be heard was the meeting after that, which was 6 weeks away. I asked how I was supposed to defend myself if I could not speak at a meeting, and she said I should have thought of that before I violated the covenants. 2 neighbors were standing near the mailbox cluster at the end of the block, whispering and pointing at my property. One of them had a phone out. I did not know if they were recording or just watching, but it felt like a performance. Anne loved an audience. I asked if there was an appeal process, and she said yes. I could file a written appeal with the board, which she would review and forward if she determined it met the procedural requirements. I said that was a conflict of interest since she was the one who filed the complaint. She said the covenants gave the secretary full discretion over procedural compliance, and if I did not like it, I could read the governing documents. I had read them. They were 74 pages of dense legalese that contradicted itself every third paragraph, and the enforcement section gave the board unilateral authority to determine violations and assess fees with no clear standard. It was a blank check. I nodded like I was losing, because I wanted her to get comfortable. I had more than photos. I had a timeline packet that I started building the day after the trash bin fine, with dates and receipts and permit confirmations and photos from the contractor I hired to do the fence work. My contractor was a guy named Miguel, who had 30 years in the business and no patience for HOA nonsense. He had told me 2 weeks ago that Anne tried to block him from entering the neighborhood, claiming he needed a vendor access form that did not exist in the covenants. He took photos of that encounter, and he had timestamps. Anne said she would be back tomorrow to verify removal, and if the post was still standing, she would assess the first daily fine. She turned and walked back toward the mailbox cluster where the 2 neighbors were still watching. One of them, a guy in a gray hoodie, gave her a thumbs up. She stopped and talked to them for a minute, gesturing back at my property, and I saw her pull out her phone. I assumed she was recruiting complaints, maybe starting a group text chain. That was her other signature move, turning neighbors into deputies. I finished bracing the post and covered the concrete with a tarp in case the drizzle picked up. My hands were shaking, and it was not from the cold. I had a decision to make. I could pull the post, lose the deposit, and restart the process in 6 weeks with Anne controlling every step, or I could leave it and fight. The problem was that fighting an HOA when the secretary controls the paper trail is like boxing in quicksand. Every move I made, she would bury under procedural delays and missing notices. But I had Miguel, and I had the timeline packet, and I had something Anne did not know about yet. Something I was holding back because I wanted to see how far she would push before I dropped it on her. I was not going to mention it yet. Not until she committed fully. Not until she felt safe. That night, I got an email from the HOA management company with a copy of the hearing notice Anne claimed was mailed. The timestamp on the email was 40 minutes after the hearing had already happened. I took a screenshot and added it to the packet. Then I got a second email, this one from the HOA insurance provider, with a subject line that said policy compliance reminder. I opened it and read 3 paragraphs about liability exposure related to unapproved contractor activity and a request that the board immediately halt all enforcement actions pending a risk review. I read it twice. It was dated 4 days ago. Anne had ignored it and kept going. I forwarded the insurance email to Miguel and asked if he had any other photos from the day Anne blocked him. He replied within 10 minutes with 6 photos showing Anne standing in front of his truck at the neighborhood entrance, holding a clipboard and refusing to move until he produced a form that did not exist. One photo showed her reaching toward his driver's side mirror like she was going to slap a sticker on it. Another showed a time-stamped dashcam frame with her blocking the lane while 2 cars waited behind. Miguel said he also had the call logs from the vendor yard where he rented the post hole digger, because Anne had called the yard that same day demanding they cancel the rental and threatening to report them to the city for doing business with an unapproved contractor. I asked Miguel if he would be willing to show up at the next board meeting, and he said absolutely. He had been waiting for someone to push back. He also said the yard supervisor was tired of Anne calling and might be willing to pull those call logs if it came to that. The next morning, I left for the job site at 5:30 and got back at 4. The fence post was still standing, and there was a bright orange sticker on my front door with a violation reference number and a line that said second notice. I peeled it off and added it to the packet. No fine notice yet, but I knew it was coming. I checked the survey stakes and 2 of them had moved again, this time another 3 inches into my yard. I took photos with a tape measure in the frame showing the distance from the original spray-painted ground marks I made when the licensed surveyor did the initial layout. The paint was still visible, and it clearly showed the stakes had been moved. I did not know if Anne was moving them herself, or if she had a neighbor doing it, but either way it was evidence of tampering. That evening Anne showed up again, this time with a rolled-up document tube and a second clipboard. She said the board had reviewed my case in an emergency session, and determined that the post was a safety hazard due to improper setback, and I was now subject to an immediate stop work order. She unrolled a site plan from the tube and spread it on the hood of her car, which she had parked half on the curb in front of my house. The plan showed the property line 6 inches farther into my lot than the licensed survey I had. I asked where she got the plan, and she said it was on file with the HOA from the original neighborhood plat. I said the plat was 40 years old and superseded by the current county records. She said the HOA covenants required compliance with the original plat regardless of county updates. I said that was not how property law works, and she said I was welcome to hire a lawyer if I wanted to waste money. I asked if I could get a copy of the plan, and she said I could request one through the records process, which required a written request and a $10 processing fee and a 14-day waiting period. I said I would take a photo of it right now, and she rolled it up and said the document was proprietary HOA property, and I was not authorized to photograph it. I took a photo anyway. She stepped between me and the hood of her car and said if I did not delete the photo, she would call the police for theft of HOA documents. I said that was absurd, and she pulled out her phone and started dialing. I deleted the photo in front of her, and she smiled and said that was a smart choice. Then she got in her car and drove off, taking the site plan with her. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit like and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories that end with satisfying payback. I called Miguel and told him about the site plan. He said he had seen that trick before, where an HOA pulls an old plat and claims it overrides current surveys to block projects they do not like. He said the county surveyor would laugh it out of the room if it ever went to court, but Anne was counting on me not having the money or time to lawyer up. He also said he had talked to the yard supervisor, and the guy was willing to testify if needed, because Anne had called him 3 more times that week, demanding he stop renting equipment to anyone working in the preserve at Oak Grove Ridge. The fine notice arrived 2 days later, taped to my front door. $50 per day starting from the date of the first violation notice, which Anne had backdated to 3 days before she ever showed up with the flashlight. The total was already $350 and climbing. The notice said payment was due within 10 days, or the HOA would place a lien on the property. I checked the mail and found a second notice, this one saying I was required to attend a special compliance hearing the following Monday at 10 in the morning. I worked job site hours, which meant I would have to call in sick and lose a day of pay. I emailed the board and said I could not attend during business hours and requested an evening slot. The reply came from Anne. Evening hearings were not available for compliance matters, and my failure to attend would result in a default judgment and immediate lien filing. I forwarded that email to Miguel and to my own records. Then I started looking for an attorney. The problem was that HOA attorneys in Seattle charge $400 an hour and want a $5,000 retainer up front, and I did not have that kind of cash sitting around. I called 3 firms and got the same answer. They could write a letter for $800, but they would not go to a hearing without the retainer. I was stuck. I could not afford a lawyer, I could not attend the hearing without losing a day of pay, and Anne had rigged the process so that any move I made would cost me money or time I did not have. The survey stakes kept getting moved, and I needed daylight photos before it happened again. But I was working 10-hour shifts and only had narrow windows at dawn and dusk. That Sunday I got a call from my neighbor 2 doors down, a woman named Claire who I had talked to maybe twice since I moved in. She said she saw what Anne was doing, and she wanted me to know that Anne had done the same thing to her last year over a deck stain color. Claire said she fought it for 3 months and eventually gave up and paid $600 in fines because she could not take the stress. She also said Anne had been removed from a previous HOA in another neighborhood after a financial audit found missing funds and improper late fees, but the preserve at Oak Grove Ridge Board had hired her anyway because she was willing to work for free. I asked Claire if she had any documentation of her case, and she said she had emails and hearing transcripts. I asked if she would be willing to share them, and she said yes. But she did not want to be named because she was afraid Anne would retaliate. I told her I understood, and she sent me a folder with 43 documents showing a pattern of selective enforcement, backdated notices, and procedural violations identical to what I was experiencing. I added Claire's documents to the timeline packet and started building a case. The packet now had the insurance email telling the board to stop, the backdated fine notice, the email proving the hearing notice was sent after the hearing, the photos of the moved survey stakes with tape measure proof, the photos from Miguel showing Anne blocking him at the neighborhood entrance, the call, logs from the vendor yard, and Claire's documents showing Anne's history of procedural abuse. But I still had the trump card, and I was not going to play it yet. I wanted Anne to go further. I wanted her to commit so hard that when I finally dropped it, there would be no walking it back. The compliance hearing was set for Monday at 10. I called in sick and lost a day of pay. I showed up at the HOA office, which was a rented room in a strip mall near the freeway. The board president and 2 other board members were sitting at a folding table, and Anne was off to the side with a laptop and a stack of file folders. There was no court reporter, no recording equipment, and no posted agenda. The president, a man named Gerald, said the hearing was to address my ongoing violation of the setback covenant and my failure to comply with the stop work order. I said I never received a stop work order in writing, and Anne said it was issued verbally and documented in the meeting minutes. I asked to see the minutes, and Gerald said they were not finalized yet. I said that was convenient, and he said if I wanted to argue procedure, I could hire a lawyer. I pulled out the timeline packet and started walking through the evidence. I showed the email timestamp proving the hearing notice was sent after the hearing. I showed the photos of the moved survey stakes. I showed the insurance email telling the board to stop enforcement. Gerald looked uncomfortable, and Anne jumped in, saying the insurance email was advisory only and did not bind the board. I said it showed the board was creating liability, and Anne said I was not qualified to interpret insurance policy. I showed the photos of Anne blocking Miguel at the neighborhood entrance and the call logs from the vendor yard. Anne said Miguel was operating without proper vendor authorization, and the yard was violating HOA policy by renting to him. I said the covenants did not require vendor authorization, and she said they did. It was in the procedural manual. I asked to see the manual, and she said it was not a public document. Gerald said the board would take my evidence under advisement and issue a decision within 10 business days. I said that was not how hearings worked. I was entitled to a ruling on the record. He said this was an informal compliance hearing, and formal procedure did not apply. I asked how I was supposed to appeal an informal ruling, and Anne said I could file a written appeal, which she would review for procedural compliance. I walked out. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. That afternoon, I got an email from the board with a PDF attachment. The ruling said my evidence was insufficient, the violation was sustained, and the fines would continue at $50 per day until I removed the post and submitted a new application with a revised survey certified by an HOA-approved surveyor. The email also said I was prohibited from further contact with board members outside of written correspondence submitted through the secretary. I called Miguel and told him what happened. He said it was time to go to the county. He also said the vendor yard supervisor wanted to talk to me because Anne had called the yard that morning and threatened to report them to the state licensing board if they continued doing business with me. The supervisor was furious and ready to cooperate. I drove to the yard and met with the supervisor, a guy named Tom who had been running the place for 15 years. He pulled the call logs and printed them for me. 11 calls from Anne over 3 weeks, all demanding that the yard stop renting to Miguel and threatening regulatory complaints. Tom said he had never seen anything like it, and he was willing to testify if it went to court. He also said Anne had tried to get him to refuse my deposit return on the post hole digger by claiming I had damaged the equipment, which was a lie. I added Tom's call logs and written statement to the packet. Then I went to the county planning office and pulled the official plat and survey records for my property. The county surveyor confirmed that my licensed survey was accurate, and the old plat Anne was using was superseded in 2003 when the neighborhood was replatted. He also said using an outdated plat to challenge a current survey was grounds for filing a complaint with the state licensing board because it misrepresented property boundaries. I asked if he would put that in writing, and he said yes. He would write a letter confirming the current boundary and noting that the HOA's plat was invalid for enforcement purposes. He gave me the letter the next day. The fines were now at $850. I got another notice saying the HOA was preparing to file a lien. I also got a third notice saying I was required to attend a second hearing to address my failure to comply with the first ruling. The second hearing was scheduled for Friday at 10, same location. That night I got a group text from a number I did not recognize. The text said, "You need to move that post or we are going to make your life miserable." There were 4 other numbers on the thread, all neighbors from the block. I did not reply. I took a screenshot and added it to the packet. Wednesday morning I woke up to find a bright orange cone in my driveway with a violation sticker on it. The sticker said unauthorized parking in common area, which was absurd because my driveway was on my property. I moved the cone to the curb and took photos. An hour later I got an email from Ann saying I had tampered with HOA safety equipment and I was being fined an additional $100. I replied with the county surveyor's letter confirming the driveway was private property. Ann replied saying the letter was irrelevant because the covenants defined common area independently of county records. I replied asking for the covenant section that defined my driveway as common area. She did not reply. Thursday evening I was finishing a shift when I got a call from Miguel. He said Ann had shown up at his house and tried to serve him with a cease and desist letter claiming he was operating an unlicensed contracting business in the neighborhood. Miguel said he had his license framed on the wall and he told her to leave or he would call the police. She left, but not before taking photos of his truck and posting them in a neighborhood Facebook group with a warning about unlicensed contractors. Miguel screenshotted the Facebook post and sent it to me. I added it to the packet. The post had 37 comments, most of them neighbors saying they had no problem with Miguel, but a few saying they were concerned about safety and asking Ann what they should do. Ann replied to every comment, saying the board was investigating and residents should report any further sightings. It was a witch hunt. Friday morning I went to the second hearing. Same room, same folding table, same 3 board members. Gerald opened by saying I had failed to comply with the first ruling, and the board was now considering additional remedies including a restraining order to prevent me from continuing construction. I said I had not done any construction since the stop work order, and he said the post was still standing, which constituted ongoing non-compliance. I pulled out the packet and walked through the new evidence, the county surveyor's letter, Tom's call logs and statement, the group text threatening me, the Facebook post Miguel sent, and the email chain showing Ann's refusal to provide the covenant section defining common area. I also showed Claire's documents proving Ann had a history of procedural abuse and selective enforcement. Gerald looked at Ann. She said the county letter was advisory, Tom's logs were hearsay, the group text was not sent by the board, and Claire's documents were from a closed matter that had no bearing on my case. She also said I was wasting the board's time with frivolous complaints, and if I continued I would be fined for harassment. I said Ann was creating liability for the HOA, and the insurance company had already warned the board to stop. Gerald said the board had consulted with the HOA attorney, and the attorney advised that the enforcement was within the board's authority. I asked to see the attorney's opinion, and Ann said it was privileged. I was about to say more, when Gerald cut me off and said the board had made its decision. The fines would continue. I was required to remove the post within 72 hours. And if I did not comply, the HOA would hire a contractor to remove it and bill me for the cost, plus a 50% administrative fee. I asked if I could appeal, and he said yes, I could file a written appeal with the secretary. I looked at Ann, and she smiled. I walked out. That afternoon I got an email from the HOA attorney. The email was addressed to the board, but I was copied, which I assumed was a mistake. The email said, "I have reviewed the compliance matter, and I am advising the board to immediately cease all enforcement actions related to the fence post." The insurance carrier has made it clear that continued enforcement creates significant liability exposure, and the procedural irregularities documented by the homeowner are sufficient to support a harassment claim. If the board proceeds, I will not be able to defend the association in litigation. The email was dated 2 days before the second hearing. Anne had received it and kept going anyway. I forwarded the email to Miguel, to Tom, to Claire, and to 2 other neighbors who had reached out privately to say they were tired of Anne's tactics. Then I printed it and added it to the packet. Saturday morning I woke up to find my truck had a bright orange sticker on the windshield saying unauthorized vehicle, tow warning, compliance required. I peeled it off and found a second sticker underneath saying the vehicle had been reported to the tow company and I had 24 hours to move it, or it would be towed at owner expense. I called the tow company and asked what was going on. The dispatcher said they had a contract with the Preserve at Oak Grove Ridge HOA to remove unauthorized vehicles, and my truck had been flagged for non-compliance with parking regulations. I said the truck was parked in my own driveway on my own property, and the dispatcher said the HOA claimed the driveway was common area. I asked if they had verified that, and he said they relied on the HOA's authorization. I told him I had documentation proving the driveway was private property, and I was willing to show it to him before they hooked my truck. He said if I had proof I should bring it to the yard and talk to the driver before the scheduled pickup. I asked when the pickup was scheduled, and he said Monday morning at 6. I spent the weekend organizing the packet into a clean binder with tabs and a timeline summary on the first page. I also printed the county surveyor's letter, the insurance email, the HOA attorney's email, and the photos of the moved survey stakes. I put everything in a folder and got ready. Monday morning at 5:45, I drove to the tow yard and waited. The driver showed up at 5:50 in a flatbed truck with the Preserve at Oak Grove Ridge logo on the door. I walked up and said I was the truck owner, and I had documentation showing the HOA was wrong. He said he did not care, he had a work order and he was going to complete it. I handed him the folder and said if he hooked my truck after seeing this, he was participating in a wrongful tow and I would hold him and the company liable. He looked annoyed, but he opened the folder. He read the county surveyor's letter first, then the insurance email, then the attorney's email. His face changed. He closed the folder and handed it back and said he was not going to touch the truck. I asked if he could put that in writing, and he said no, but he would call the dispatcher and tell them to cancel the order. He pulled out his phone and made the call right there, saying the HOA had given him bad information, and he was not going to complete the pickup. The dispatcher argued with him for a minute, and then the driver said he did not care what the HOA wanted. He was not going to hook a truck that was legally parked on private property. He hung up and told me the HOA was going to be pissed, but that was their problem. He also said I was the 3rd person that month who had called him with proof that the HOA was lying about parking violations, and he was getting tired of being used as muscle for bad enforcement. I thanked him and drove home. By the time I got there, I had an email from Anne saying the tow company had refused to complete the authorized removal, and the HOA was filing a complaint against me for interfering with HOA operations. I replied with a copy of the attorney's email telling the board to stop, and I copied the entire board, the management company, and the insurance carrier. I did not get a reply. That week I filed a complaint with the county ombudsman and requested an investigation into HOA governance practices at the Preserve at Oak Grove Ridge. I also filed a records request with the HOA asking for all financial records related to late fees and enforcement actions for the past 3 years. Anne replied saying the request was overly broad and I would need to narrow it to specific line items. I replied saying I was entitled to full financial disclosure under state law, and if she refused I would file a complaint with the state attorney general. 2 days later I got an email from the management company saying the HOA was conducting an internal review of recent enforcement actions, and all pending fines were suspended pending the outcome. The email also said Anne had been removed from direct enforcement duties, and future compliance matters would be handled by a third-party management firm. I checked the neighborhood Facebook group and found a post from Gerald saying the board had voted to hire an independent auditor to review HOA financial records following concerns raised by multiple residents. The post had 64 comments, most of them neighbors saying it was about time. Claire sent me a private message saying she had heard from 2 other neighbors who were planning to run for the board in the next election, and they wanted to challenge Anne's procedural control. She also said a group of residents was organizing a recall petition to remove Anne from the board entirely, but they needed signatures from 20% of the membership to trigger a vote. I signed the petition. The independent audit took 6 weeks. The auditor found that Anne had been assessing late fees on notices that were never properly mailed, backdating violation letters to inflate penalties, and using a personal label maker to tag properties without board approval. The auditor also found that Anne had transferred $11,000 in collected fines into a separate account that was not reported to the board and had been using the account to pay for HOA expenses without authorization. The audit report was posted on the HOA website and emailed to every member. The fallout was immediate. Gerald called an emergency board meeting, and Anne was removed as secretary. She was also removed as meeting chair and lost control of the microphone, which meant she could no longer control who spoke or how long. 3 residents, including Claire, were appointed to an interim governance committee to oversee enforcement and records access, while the board searched for a new management company. The board also voted to send a correction email retracting Anne's enforcement actions, and every resident who had been fined under her watch received a refund check. My refund was $850, plus an apology letter signed by Gerald. But I was not done. The recall petition gathered enough signatures to trigger a special election. Anne tried to fight it, claiming the petition had procedural defects, but the interim governance committee reviewed it and certified it as valid. The election was scheduled for 8 weeks out, and 3 candidates announced they were running against Anne for her board seat. I did not run. I had done enough. But I campaigned for the challengers, and I showed up at every candidate forum with the timeline packet and a calm, detailed breakdown of what Anne had done and how the board had let it happen. The election flipped the power dynamic. Anne lost her seat by a 43-point margin. The 3 new board members ran on a transparency and accountability platform, and their first act was to vote for an independent review of all pending enforcement actions and a moratorium on new fines until the review was complete. The new board also hired a professional management company that had no ties to Anne and implemented a new hearing process with recorded meetings, written transcripts, and a requirement that all enforcement notices be sent by certified mail with proof of delivery. 2 months later, the HOA issued a formal finding that Anne had violated state law by misrepresenting property boundaries, selectively enforcing covenants, and retaliating against residents who challenged her authority. The finding was forwarded to the state attorney general, who opened an investigation into HOA governance practices and financial controls. Anne moved out of the neighborhood 3 months after the election. I heard she tried to join the board of another HOA in a nearby city, but they rejected her application after a background check turned up the audit findings and the attorney general investigation. I finished the fence. It took 2 more weekends, and Miguel was there to help. The post that started the whole fight is still standing, and the survey stakes have not moved since Anne left. The fence is 48 inches high, exactly where the licensed surveyor said it should be. And I have a plaque on the gate that says installed 2025, code compliant, no HOA approval required. Claire joined the new board and became vice president. She pushed through a policy requiring the board to publish enforcement statistics every quarter, including the number of violations, the number of fines assessed, and the number of fines refunded. The first report showed that under Anne's watch, the HOA had assessed over $78,000 in fines and refunded less than $2,000. Under the new board, fines dropped by 86% and refunds went up by 300%. The vendor yard supervisor, Tom, sent me a thank you card saying I had saved him from months of harassment and he wanted to buy me a beer. Miguel framed a photo of the completed fence and hung it in his workshop with a note that said first project where the HOA lost. I kept the timeline packet in a file cabinet in my garage. Every few months, someone in the neighborhood reaches out to say they are dealing with a new compliance issue and they heard I had documentation that might help. I make copies and I walk them through the process, document everything, keep timestamps, get witnesses, and do not back down just because the board controls the paperwork. The Preserve at Oak Grove Ridge Association is not perfect, but it is better. The new board is not interested in weaponizing the covenants, and the professional management company does not let board members freelance enforcement. There are still disputes, but but they get resolved in hearings that follow procedure and produce written rulings that residents can actually appeal. I still see Anne's label maker stickers sometimes, stuck to mailboxes and fence posts around the old neighborhood, faded and peeling, but still there like scars. I leave them alone. They are a reminder that HOAs can be tools for community or weapons for control, and it depends entirely on who is holding the gavel. More HOA drama soon.